All right, I think I'm going to hand over admittance to Darren at this point and start getting going. I know Darren's put a couple things in chat, but if anyone doesn't know, I'm Camille from Chouinard's Beekeeping Department, and put together a couple little slides here. Basically, we're going to go over basic hive inspections, what you should see and what you shouldn't see, and if you see the things you shouldn't see, what exactly to do with those things. So I know a lot of you are new beekeepers. I'm seeing lots of familiar names, so that's pretty awesome. Welcome to class, and we'll have some questions at the end. So go ahead and put your questions into chat, and I'll try to get to them as we go along, or we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. See if I can get these slides going. All right. So before you ever inspect your hive, it's a really good idea to just have all of your stuff together. Maybe if you have a toolbox or something, this can really help you out. You are going to need to look for a couple of things during your hive inspection. You need to know that your colony has enough space to expand and grow. You need to know that your frames and foundation are in good condition. You don't need to replace anything. You're looking for the health of your bees. You want good stores of pollen and honey. You want plenty of good patterned eggs and brood. And then you're also going to want to inspect for potential diseases and disorders and mites and things like that that could be wrong with your hive. Typically speaking, you're going to want to do your hive inspection probably once every 2 weeks during peak season. In that case, you'll know if something goes wrong and you'll be able to remedy it. You can do more frequent inspections, totally fine. Don't get in there too often or you'll start to rile the bees up, and you do have a potential of, if you bother them too often, actually having them swarm. So before inspecting, I know I said this briefly, but make sure you've got all of your tools together. You need your hive tool. I carry it around absolutely everywhere with me. I've got it here today. It's just kind of hanging around. But if you use a frame rack, make sure to have that on you. Any bee brushes, your smoker is almost always essential. You don't have to use it if you're uncomfortable using it, but just have it on reserve if you need it. It's really nice to have around. I'm really bad about this, but having a notebook or a logbook is really nice. If you see a problem developing, you can track it. If you see that the weather is crummy one day and notice that your bee's behavior is a little bit different, you'll kind of know why. Before you even get into the hive, you can tell quite a bit about your hive's activity and health. You can just take a look and see how many foragers are going back and forth, if they're going in a good pattern, if they're really scattered. You'll kind of know what to expect before you get into the hive, just from simple observations. And you'll learn these over time. When you actually get into open the hive, positioning is really important. You can work from the back side. I prefer to work from the side, especially if you have a frame perch. This will allow you to put the frame perch on the side, and you can actually lift your frames up really easily without having to bend funny. So you're going to start by smoking the entrance lightly. You get a little bit of smoke going throughout the hive. And what the smoke does is it kind of tricks the bees into thinking, oh, well, there's a fire around. So there's not really too much that really can be done as far as defense. The main thing you don't want them to think is that you're a bear getting into your hive, because in that case, they're going to start sharing those alarm pheromones and they're going to get worked up into a frenzy. So a little bit of smoke goes a long ways, not only for the beekeeper, but for the bees as well. So after you smoke the entrance, you lift your top and your inner cover. You may have a flat standard inner cover, which is really, really small, or you may have the larger Vivaldi inner cover. Either way, just take this off and set it to the side. If you have a telescoping top, this works great as a shelf, and you can put your hive equipment on your telescoping top as you move around. If you have any honey supers, you can take a quick look at this, but set that on the side. You have the chance of attracting robbers if you have a full honey super off of your hive for any length of time. So it's a good idea to cover that. You can use your inner cover and just put that over the top, or if you have a little sheet or something, that works as well. So in order to make hive inspecting easier, you're going to want to pull one of your outside frames. The outside frames in a hive box that has plenty of space are likely to be empty on one side, maybe even partially used on the other side. So it's going to be pretty lightweight, and you can just set that on your telescoping cover or on your frame perch, and that'll give you a lot more room to work inside your hive. All right. Pulling a frame of pollen or honey, that's going to be, once we get into frame hierarchy, frame 2. Wind and weather, you've got to be careful. If you've got a lot of cold wind coming through, you don't want to pull brood frames too much, because if you chill the brood, that can really damage them. So we've got a couple of photos here. You can see on the right, there's a frame perch holding 3 frames, and you can see just how much room you've got in that hive box itself. It really makes it easier to have a frame perch like this. You can use a frame grip, which you'll see in the left-hand picture. It's not necessary. You can use your fingers, but sometimes the frames are kind of hard to get to, and just using a hive tool is a little bit difficult. So the frame grippers can have their purpose there. It's really important to keep your frames organized. If you swap, say, frame 3 and frame 5, you may end up breaking up your brood cluster, which is going to make it a lot harder for the bees to keep organized and keep their brood in a healthy condition. So make sure that if you're pulling a frame out, you put it back exactly as you found it. Inspecting for status. So the first thing you're going to want to know is, what kind of population do you have? What kind of density are you looking at on your frames and on the top bars of your frames? When you pull your inner cover off, you should see quite a bit of activity on top of the frames. And once you pull the frames, a full-size colony is going to have almost full coverage, at least on your middle frames there. You're looking for stores, patterning, and the health of your foundation. This frame here looks like it was largely used for brood. As you can tell, a lot of the center here is pretty dark. It's not full of brood right now, but that's what it was used for before. We've got a ring of pollen around the edge too. That's kind of the more orangey color there. And you've got a good population of bees in the center, but this isn't one of your absolute center frames, so it's okay that you don't have complete coverage here. The photo on the right here looks like a really healthy populist colony. If you see this when you open your hive, then that's a really great sign. On the left, it looks like they are starting to actually run out of space. The fresh white comb on top is just a sign that they're trying to expand and they're not really having much room. So you can smoke them a little bit to make them move inside, and scrape that burr comb off, and it's probably time to add another box when you see patterning like this. So here are a couple of examples of exactly what you do and don't want to see as far as comb building. The photo on the top right, or the top left rather, this is an excellent frame right here. It looks like this was actually used for honey gathering. You've got nicely drawn frames. It looks really clean. All the cappings are already off. It looks like the bees have already been at work here. If you have old frames from last year that look like this, it's a great resource. Definitely use those in your hives this year. The other 2 photos, not so great. The bottom middle here, you have some improperly drawn comb, and the bees are going to have a hard time using it. You're going to have a hard time moving it around in the hive. It's going to get stuck, and it's just not going to be a good thing. So if this frame were built with right cell foundation, you would be able to reuse it simply by scraping off all of the excess comb you see here. But because this frame was built with real wax, there's really not too much you can do to salvage it. And at this point, I would just toss out the entire frame. Up here at the top right, we have a modified Vivaldi inner cover, and it has a bunch of whiting on top, which is really not ideal. You're not going to be able to fit your feeder in here. Signs like this can tell that maybe you need to add another box. Your bees are starting to run out of room. It's really great fresh comb. So if you want, you can smoke your bees a little bit to kind of get them out of the way, and you can actually thump your bees back into the hive or at the front of the hive, kind of like you would with a new package installation. And then you can actually take this foundation and ball it up and use it for wax making later on if you're into that kind of thing. It's definitely a useful thing to have around. All sorts of cool things you can do with fresh wax. But it's really important that when you're taking this wax, if you don't want it, don't throw it right in front of your hive, because then you're going to just invite robbers in. And that's really not what you want to do. So if you don't want it, make sure you take it well away from the hive, throw it out into a field somewhere, or just throw it in the garbage. So a couple of interesting photos here. You can tell a lot about what the comb is used for just based on the color and the age of it as well. So starting over here on the left, we've got brand new drawn comb. It's going to be nice and soft. The bees haven't walked over it and messed it up at all. It looks like they've got a little bit of nectar in here right now. And you've got your marked queen up here. It looks like probably an Italian or a mixed breed. The center photo, we are looking at pollen stores. Just a quick glance, even if you don't see what's actually inside the cells, will tell you that these are pollen cells. They've got kind of an orangey color, but the cool thing about pollen and bee bread is they can be all sorts of different colors. Earlier this year, I saw pollen that was just absolutely blood red. It was very striking color. So it's kind of cool to check out different times a year what kind of pollen stores you're going to get.
Yeah, she doesn't want to hear us.
Sorry, what was that? If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself real fast. Otherwise, I'll keep going and I'll try to check the chat to see if I can find anything there. Darren brought up a really interesting pollen source the other day. You might see certain times in the year bright blue pollen coming in. So definitely worth a look, see what your bees are bringing in. On the far right here, we have brood chambers. They can be a little bit weird looking at this frame, like, oh, it looks dark, it looks dead, it looks black. These are just brood chambers. The worker bees have a bit of a tough time cleaning this out because they aren't quite as long as the queen and fully drawn comb. Once you have a larva hatch from that and become a new bee, they leave a little cocoon at the bottom of the cell, which the workers can't quite clean all the way out, and it gives the cells a darker color. So if you're using old foundation for, say, your honey supers or something, you can use it. It's just going to look kind of dark. Frame hierarchy. This is what I wanted to get to a little bit earlier. I think you should change the frames around here. So this just makes it a lot easier when you're talking to someone about your hive. You can pick out a number. If you are writing things down in your logbook as well, it'll make it really easy for you to know, like, okay, this is exactly the position of the frame that I'm talking about. So on the outsides of your hive, you're going to have frames 1 and 1. These frames are typically going to be more or less empty. You may have a little bit of honey stores, some pollen stores here as well. Frames 2 and 3 are going to start being used. They're going to be mostly for resource collection. You'll see honey on here mostly. You'll see a little bit of pollen. And then as you get closer to the center, you're going to start seeing brood, but you're going to have kind of a mixture on frames 3 and 4 here. Frames 5 and 5, on the other hand, in the very center, you should see almost exclusively packed with brood, maybe a small band of nectar or honey as well. Stores and patterning. We've got a couple photos here of nice capped honey. The bottom one is ready to spin. The top one, we've got some empty cells still, so maybe wait for a little while longer there. Looks like I have gone over a couple of these bullet points here. Frames 1 and 2, again, are typically resource frames for honey and pollen. Those are your very outside frames. They might have a little bit of brood, that's all right as well. Queen status. This is something that a lot of beekeepers can have trouble with. A lot of beekeepers, they think they need to find the queen in order to know she's there. But really all you need to find is you just need to find her work. You can find the queen herself if you have her marked. This makes it a lot easier, but I typically just look for signs of my queen, and I can tell her health just based on her leavings. This photo right here is a cutaway of a brood frame right here. You can see several eggs in each of the cells, and you can see that there's one egg per cell. They're all centered at the very bottom. If you see a laying worker, which can be a problem down the road, you're going to see many eggs, up to probably 7 eggs per cell. And a lot of those are going to be on the sides because workers can't lay all the way in the bottom. They're just not long enough. You're also going to see some different stages of brood life here as well. And this milky stuff that they're in is royal jelly. The first couple of days of every bee's life, they are fed royal jelly. And depending on what kind of a bee they're going to be, their diet changes from then on. And they'll have a different mixture of a little bit of royal jelly and some bee bread as well. The queens are fed exclusively royal jelly until they are completely finished developing. So these are a couple of photos here of my personal hive at home. You can see the different stages of brood, starting with the eggs here. And this is brand new foundation. I started with a package and I had no drawn comb whatsoever. So it's really easy to see the different stages of brood here. If you have previously drawn or older foundation, you're going to have a little bit of a harder time finding them. And when we're looking at the young larvae here, it's important to know that you've got a couple different ages. Towards the bottom, we've got older larvae. Towards the top, we have younger larvae. The capped brood sometimes can be mistaken for honey stores, but the main difference here is the honey stores are going to have slightly sunken cappings, and they're going to look kind of wet and liquidy, whereas the capped brood is going to be maybe slightly concave, but more or less flat. And they're going to be much lighter colored as well. Normal brood patterning. So we're getting in from the outer frames into more center frames. Frames 3 and 4 coming from the outside. They should be a nice mixture of brood, pollen, honey, and nectar. Typically what you're going to see here is the middle or bottom of the frame is going to be reserved for the brood. Then you're going to have a nice band of pollen here going all the way around. And on the very outside, you're going to see some honey stores as well. This is a really nice looking frame right here. You can see a couple different larvae in there, some capped brood, all sorts of different things. I think this is actually just a different take on the same photo. Just sort of shows you the solid brood here in the middle with a couple that have hatched already, and then that nice band of pollen and honey. And this is also an example of what I was just talking about, the difference between capped brood and capped honey. You can see the capped honey, the cappings look kind of wet, whereas the brood, they don't look wet at all, and they're more or less just a light, nice color there. And basic frame reading. So we're getting closer to the center here. This is more or less an actual brood frame. Almost this whole frame is covered in brood right now. And it's kind of hard to tell, but I think there are a few younger larvae on the outskirts here as well. It's okay to see a little bit of resources on these frames as well, but they should be more or less completely brood in the center 5-5 and maybe even 4-4 here. I've got a question down here. It looks like, can we eat the wax? Wax is actually a funny story. It's an early form of chewing gum. So you can eat it. Most people will just chew it and spit it out. But there are lots of different ways that you can use wax. You can use it in skin products, facial balms. You can use it in candle making. There's all sorts of cool uses for it. Do you leave those little bits of wax at the bottom of the frame or scrape it off? It really depends, honestly. If you're seeing lots of queen cups down here, it's probably a good idea to scrape them off. Otherwise, just keep a real good eye on them and make sure you don't actually wind up with any queen larvae. The burr comb at the bottom can make it a little bit more difficult to move frames around, so a lot of beekeepers will go ahead and scrape those off. And it's a lot easier if you're going to scrape them off to do it every time you do your hive inspection rather than doing it when it's a full-on comb. But it's not 100% necessary to scrape them off if you're just seeing regular brood frames down here. It's a different thing altogether when you start seeing drone cells down here. The cells on this particular burr comb look to be about the same size as the rest of the brood, but if they're much larger, those are drone, and you want to scrape those off because drone brood is basically just a breeding ground for Varroa mites. They don't really do anything for your hive.
It's just fascinating. I don't want to get into it. I mean, you have to tell me that you were.
All right, so now that you know what you're looking for and what you should see, there are several different problems that can be pretty easy to fix or should be fixed right away before they become larger problems. Bees can be subject to many pests, parasites, diseases, both bacterial and fungal. So it's really important to learn to recognize warning signs to treat it before it's too late. I think I have it in here. Yep, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's very true with beekeeping. So some indicator diseases can really help you diagnose other diseases in the hives. Deformed wing virus is, as sad as it is, actually a really important indicator that you have some Varroa mite problems. Several different things will cause deformed wing virus, so it's not necessarily absolutely Varroa mites. It could be tracheomites or some other diseases as well. But when you see that, you know that you need to provide some action to save those bees. Many diseases can be treated with chemical or cultural controls, improving ventilation, moving your hive into a sunnier area, or using certain acids or miticides. But there are some diseases out there that will unfortunately just require complete disposal of your frames, burning of your equipment. So it's important to know if you've got a really dire thing going on or you've got something that you can really treat. And going back to an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, the stronger your colony is, the healthier it is, the less likely it is to be affected by any of these problems. So make sure that you have a good location, lots of sun, protection from wind, ample food, water, excellent space to grow, don't let your hives get too cramped, and a good integrated pest management schedule, particularly when it comes to Varroa mites. So we'll start with just distinguishing between different diseases here. Brood diseases are pretty easy to spot. They basically just affect the brood, and you can pull a frame and see exactly what's going on here. Foul brood, chalk brood are pretty easy to spot when you do your regular hive inspections. Adult diseases can be a little bit more difficult to diagnose. Nosema and dysentery are some of the ones that you'll really need to pay attention to the actions of your adult bees. So American foul brood and European foul brood, they have many similar characteristics, but they are quite different as far as symptoms and how or whether or not you can treat them. Question from Rick. I had read that the hive needed midday shade. Should they be in full sun? We have them under a maple tree. Having some midday shade is definitely an okay thing to do. it's really nice during midsummer to have some shade for the bees, or to have extra water, or maybe even some shade then during the heat of summer. But if you have to choose between shade in winter and full sun in summer, it's better to go full sun in summer. The shade in winter, it's just, they're not going to be able to warm up to forage, and they won't be able to get enough food. So really, it's best to have a good mix. But if you have to choose between shade and sun, then sun is the better choice. So Darren's got a couple things in chat here for you as far as American foul brood and European foul brood. European foul brood is treatable, and it's good to get it early, but you can save your bees from it. Whereas American foul brood is much more dire, and you can treat it with certain things like bee chemotherapy. I think it is called terramycin, which you can actually get prescribed by a licensed veterinarian. But when you have American foul brood, it's almost always a death sentence for your bees, unfortunately. An easy way to tell the difference between American foul brood and European foul brood is what's called the stick test. Take a little toothpick or a stick or a piece of grass or something and swirl it around inside one of your infected cells here, like you'll see in this picture, and then pull it out. If you can get the bees to be maybe about an inch out of the cell, still sticking like a rope to your stick, then you have American foul brood. And this is much more dire than European foul brood because the larva is so sticky, the bees cannot clean inside those cells, and they just spread it to the rest of the colony. Whereas European foul brood, they are easy to remove. The bees can actually clean the cells, and requeening can actually significantly help your problem here. Chalk brood. This one is actually pretty common. It's not my favorite disease, but it is possible to treat. It's a fungal disease, so good ventilation is going to be your number one fix here. If you have your hive in a nice sunny location, you've got plenty of ventilation, maybe you have a screen bottom board, make sure to remove your mite board. If you have a Vivaldi inner cover, make sure that you have all of your screens open. You may want to actually put another entrance in your top brood box as well, and this could help. But if the problem persists after you've done this, probably a week or so afterwards, then requeening can actually really help as well. If you have a more hygienic queen, she'll raise better larvae, and then they will have better cleaning practices, and it'll fix the problem. And got a bit of a graphic photo here of deformed wing virus. If you see a lot of bees towards the entrance of your hive that can't fly, they don't have properly formed wings, this is a great indicator that something is wrong in your hive and it needs your immediate attention. I don't see a Varroa mite on this bee, but it looks like they probably have quite the mite load going on if you're seeing tens or dozens of bees with deformed wings. So nosema and dysentery. Nosema can cause dysentery, but dysentery doesn't necessarily mean you have nosema. They cause weakness, shortened lifespan by up to 50% in adult bees, and it's very easily spread. Cultural practices for prevention, like keeping your hive healthy, having good ventilation, having good sunlight, feeding well, will help to prevent nosema. But there are certain things that you can use to treat it as well. Darren, do you remember the medication for nosema? We have some on the shelf, but it's rarely used because every now and then it just doesn't work. Nosema has become slightly resistant to the medication, but it's definitely worth a try.
I don't, but I'll grab one really quick.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Fumiglen, Fumiglen B. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Tracheal mites. These are a little difficult.
We had a question in chat on the visuals on foul brood. Can you take a step back and cover that real quick?
Yes. Other than the toothpick test, is there a visual way to tell you have foul brood? There's a visual and olfactory way to tell, actually. The different foul broods have a very different smell. Unfortunately, I can't really help you with any experience from it. My nose isn't the best. But when you have American foul brood, it's going to have a really acrid, really, really bad smell to it. You'll be able to tell just by holding the frame in front of your face. Whereas if you have European foul brood, you are going to have more of a sour smell to it, like rotten milk. It's definitely not a good smell, but it's not going to make you run for the hills like like the American foul brood. Another way to tell is with American foul brood, you're going to have kind of twisted larvae, and they're going to have their proboscises extended outwards. So look for their tongues, and that's another just visual way of telling. And are the vendors selling pure honey? That depends on the vendor. I think it was back in the 90s. That was before I was really even conscious. We were having trouble with vendors selling honey that had been altered and had sugar added and all these other things. So that's kind of where cut comb honey became really popular, because it's really difficult to alter cut comb honey. When you have the comb and the honey in it, you're almost guaranteed that it's pure honey. So I can't actually guarantee that honey on the shelves is going to be pure. There are certain vendors around here that I know are really great. Old Blue, Queen Bee, a couple of the apiaries around here produce really nice pure honey, and it's all local. So if you have allergies, that can potentially help with those as well. All right, I think we were talking about tracheal mites here. The great news with tracheal mites is you will almost never have to worry about these, because if you're treating for Varroa mites, many of your thymals and acids are going to keep away the tracheal mites as well. If you wind up with tracheal mites, unfortunately, it's pretty difficult to diagnose, but same with chalk brood, requeening is an option here. Grease patty feeding is also an option. If you feed the bees grease, they will have essentially a greased up trachea, and the mites will have a lot harder time holding on. And the grease patties are pretty easy to make. We don't sell them here, so just check out a couple of videos on YouTube, and they'll use Crisco or something like that in order to make up a grease patty, which looks similar in the end to a protein patty. So as far as the miticides, the natural thymol is great for treating these. So if you happen to be treating for Varroa and you are looking for a treatment that will also help with tracheal mites, thymol is a great way to go. So that would be your Apigard. And moving on to a bigger problem than tracheal mites, the Varroa mite. The Varroa mites, unfortunately, are a worldwide problem, and they need to be treated almost invariably in order to have a successful hive that lasts year-round. You can use several different methods in order to find your mite load. You can use an alcohol wash, which involves swirling about 300 bees or so, about a cup of bees in an alcohol wash to kill them. When this happens, the mites let go of the bees and fall to the bottom. And we've got kind of a double canister going on. You can make your own, or you can buy your Varroa Easy Check here at the store as well, and it'll do the same thing. You basically check at the bottom. Once all of your bees are dead, the mites have dropped down, and you'll be able to count the dead mites at the bottom of your alcohol wash. If you see any number of mites, usually the threshold is 2 or 3, then it's time to treat. The mite board that I have here is actually a check that I did on my own hive after treating with Apiguard. And this is probably a month and a half after treating. I left my board in for about 5 days and I found 1 individual mite. I think I'm going to wait until after honey harvest to treat again, but I know that I will need to treat at that point because I see any kind of mites at all. It's a good idea to use a variety of treatment strategies here. I think everybody's probably heard of Roundup Ready weeds. We really are trying not to make that a thing with Varroa mites as well. So try and use different treatments every time you treat. It's a good idea, Janice, to treat for mites, even if you don't see any when you first receive a package or a nucleus hive. It's part of the integrated pest management system. If you don't see any mites, it doesn't necessarily mean there aren't any. And because they are so prevalent just everywhere, it's a good idea to treat and just make sure you continue to be miteless. Typically, my mite treatments happen 3 to 4 times per year. You can shake bees with powdered sugar as well. You can find more information in that respect in The Backyard Beekeeper, my favorite go-to book. I have never used the powdered sugar wash myself, but I have read that it does work and it works similarly to the alcohol wash. All right, managing for Varroa mites. Again, use a variety of treatments. And same with any other bacterial or any sort of disease. Good feeding, good supplements can really help to prevent these guys. Drone frames are an interesting physical form of mite treatment. You know that drones are going to be a different sized cell and a different setup altogether from your workers. So we have special frames with drone foundation where the queen will lay exclusively drones on that frame. And what you want to do is you want to let all of those drone be laid, have a full frame of drone. And then as soon as those drones get capped over, you know that all the Varroa mites are kind of trying to reproduce on the drones. You take that frame out, toss it in the freezer for probably 2 or 3 days. That will kill all of your drones and all of your mites. And then you can remove it from the freezer while it is still frozen. Very important here. You can take your frame knife or your tines and just cut all those cappings off. And then once you've got the exposed drone larvae, which are already dead, you can put them back into your hive, have the bees clean it out, and then repeat the process. You're going to kill quite a few mites this way, but it's still a good idea to continue your integrated pest management with different miticides and acids and things.
Camille, I'm going to step you back in the chat just a little bit here. We had a question about using vaporized mineral oil, and that's something I don't know anything about. Is that something you've been reading about?
Vaporized mineral oil, I actually don't know anything about that, but that is a good question.
So Jennifer, rather than holding up the whole presentation, I think if you would like to shoot us an email, I'll do a little more looking into that and follow up with you. It's not something that's in my repertoire right now.
Definitely. I made a quick note of it, and go ahead and send me an email. I'll do a little bit of research on that and get back to you. All right, where were we here? I think we've already gone through most of this. Effective monitoring includes your in-hive inspections, which you're doing bi-weekly. using your mite boards, which you see here, and the phoretic sampling, which would be your alcohol wash. So keep an eye on the mites, keep your integrated pest management system going, and you should be able to handle the mites in your hive fairly effectively. Again, a little bit of repeat here. Managing Varroa mites requires just keeping a healthy hive, keep feeding your sugar water, make sure that they are getting ample amounts of food. Supplements like Pro Health here, it's very similar to Honeybee Healthy, can show some benefit. I haven't actually found any scientific reports that these work for sure, but I've had a lot of people that swear by these. So if you add probably, I think this bottle requires about a tablespoon per gallon, then that can really help your bees as well. I've got a little bit of information down here on just different mite treatments. There are a couple of things that you should take a look at when you are treating, just to figure out which treatments are going to be best for you. First off, you're going to want to consider what time of year it is and how your brood patterning is. Apiguard, for instance, will not penetrate your capped brood in order to kill the mites inside. So if you have uncapped brood, if you've got a brand new package, there's no capped brood in there at all, Apiguard is a great one to use. It's very effective. If you have capped brood, you've got a full-size colony going, Formic Pro may be a better choice because it will actually sink through those cappings and they will kill the mites on the developing larva as well. Something else that's really important to think about, a lot of people have had brood losses or queen losses when using some of these medications. And I think the temperature has quite a bit to do with that. Most of these are fumigants or gels, which require a certain amount of heat to work. So if you're using these medications when it's too cold or too hot, you run the risk of either having it not work or having it work too well and winding up hurting your bees as well as the Varroa mites. So I've got a couple of temperatures listed down here. Thiamol, for example, is good between daytime temperatures of 60 and 105 degrees. So it's a good one to use in the summer when it's really hot, but as long as it's not too hot. Formic acid, you got to watch during the summer because you don't want to use it when it's above 84 degrees daytime temperatures. But it can be nice to use in the earlier spring when temperatures aren't normally 60 degrees. Hot beta acids, we will carry sometimes, but it's kind of hard to get them in stock. They are a weaker form of miticide, but it's all natural and organic. It can be used between 52 and 92 degrees. Oxalic acid, I unfortunately don't have too much experience with, but it's a really great method to use during winter time when your bees are in their cluster. It can also be damaging to brood, so it's important to make sure that your hive is broodless when you're using oxalic acid. I think we're getting towards the end here, just a quick recap. So as far as inspecting your hives, it's really an important thing to do because when you learn to read your hive, you learn what's normal, you learn what's not, you're able to stop problems before they become catastrophic. And it's just going to be a lot easier on you to treat your problems before they get out of hand. Again, the biweekly hive inspection, you can do it more often, but biweekly is just a really good schedule to keep. And it's important to remember that problems in your hive don't necessarily only affect your hive. Your bees are pretty often going to be traveling up to 3 miles. So if there are other hives in the area, if your bees have some sort of a problem, they could be spreading it to other hives as well, and vice versa. So I know that's a lot of information, and we are going to be putting this entire presentation on YouTube so you can revisit it as much as you'd like. But if you'd like a little more information, I can come out and do an actual hive inspection with you. I can get into your hive and just kind of give you a quick tutorial, and if you have any problems, I'll help you to treat, things like that. We do offer the Hive consultations for about $75 to visit. So if you're interested, you can sign up on our website and I'll come out and do some beekeeping with you. All right, thanks everybody. You can reach me at my email address or just via phone and ask for Camille. I think at this point I will ask everybody to unmute, and if you've got any questions, we can, looks like we've got about 15 minutes here for everybody. And thanks everyone for your time. This was actually my first presentation, so I think it went decently.
Thank you. Camille, our bees were building their comb up into the feeder tube.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a new, we got a new nuke a few weeks ago when you guys had them. So we pulled the feeder apart and removed the comb and then added another, even though they hadn't filled 70% of the box, we added another box on top just to keep them out of the feeder tube. Was that okay, or should we pull that top one off?
That's definitely okay. Chances are you're not going to have the bottom box fill out those last 2 or 3 frames, but bees naturally want to build upwards. When you see them in trees and things, they're going to build really vertically. So if they're building into your feeder, they probably just want to expand upwards, and that's totally fine to add into the box.
Great, thank you.
Is there some point in time when, if you're reusing drawn comb, that, the very dark black comb that's been used for brood, is there a point in time or some way that you can tell that you wouldn't want to reuse that anymore?
Yes, you don't necessarily want to reuse it every time. If you have, let me bring you back real fast, just for a visual here. So if you see frames that have remnants of chalk brood or something like that, then it could be a better idea to use, to toss these out. If you have right cell foundation, you can actually scrape all of the wax off and let the bees rebuild, and that's totally fine. But if you have just an old dirty frame that still has nice structural integrity, something like this is completely fine to use, even though it's really dark. It's just older.
The other thing
Okay.
I want to look at is cell diameters. Really old frames start shrinking in a little bit. So look at your cell sizes and structural integrity. That's a bigger guide than anything else for can you reuse old wax.
All right, thanks.
Let's see. Lucid Dawn. Where are we located? We're located right on the outskirts of Corvallis, in between Corvallis and Philomath on Highway 34, Chenard's nursery. I'm having some chat problems. 1 second. What if I cut my own imperfect foundation and the bees built in a way that when I pull the frame, comb breaks and honey gets everywhere? Major newbie fail. That's actually not a newbie fail. I do the same thing sometimes. When you have imperfect foundation, it's difficult to get out of the hive. You're going to have some leaks and some honey. Try your best to keep it inside the hive and your bees will clean that up just fine. If you get it on the outside of the hive, you are inviting robbers and things. So just take your hive tool and kind of scrape away as much as you can. But when you see that you've broken comb like that, just make sure to take your hive tool and kind of scrape away any of the extra foundation that's going to get in the way so that the bees will rebuild it properly and you won't have to deal with that every time.
In chat, how do you know when to add a honey super and when to stop feeding the bees?
So that question actually has the answer hidden within it as well. You stop feeding your bees when you add your honey super, because your bees will occasionally take your sugar syrup and add it into the cells for the honey super. So if you want pure honey, make sure that you're not feeding sugar water. keeping an eye on what plants are blooming is really going to help you know when to put your honey super on. In our local area, blackberries are the main honey flow event. So when they begin to bloom, and they're beginning to bloom right now, I haven't seen too many, but there are some out there. Now is about the time when you want to put your honey super on. You should have a decent population. You should have one full brood box, probably most of a full second brood box. And when you're putting your honey super on, especially if you're using brand new undrawn frames, it's a good idea to put your super on first and let your bees build up a little bit before you put your queen excluder in, just to kind of encourage them to build that out. My success rate, typically for overwintering your bees. This is actually kind of a funny question, and I'm going to admit how much of a newbie I am here. I have only been beekeeping since about July of last year. I did have some success overwintering. I had 6 hives in the beginning, and some of them were taken to Chico, so I can't really count those. But of the 4 hives that I had, I did a couple experiments with Vivaldi boards and moisture boards. And I actually did end up overwintering one of my 4 hives that did not have a moisture board on top of it. They suffered some winter attrition. They were a very small colony when they came out of overwintering, but I was able to keep one.
Can you put the pollen patty in the feeder box? Is that acceptable?
They won't necessarily eat it if it's in the feeder box. They don't really want the substitute protein. They'd rather have the protein from actual real pollen. But if you put it into a place where proximity is part of it, if you put it directly on top of your brood frames and just kind of squish it in, then they will consume it. But a lot of the times, if you put it in your Vivaldi box, they won't really touch it.
Okay, and there's another thing about the burlap. I was kind of having a problem keeping the smoke consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Do you wet it down, or you got any tricks there? It's like when I rolled it really tight, lit it, and then it was just on fire, and I was trying to figure out a trick to just make it work better. More smoke.
I have some inconsistencies there as well. Typically, if you let the burlap burn for a little bit, you get a flame going, and then you knock the flame most of the way out and kind of shake your smoker, you can get some consistent smoke going. But it seems to differ with environmental constraints as well. Like last year when we had the smoke event, I was having almost not enough oxygen in the air to light my smoker at all, versus when it's overcast and cloudy, it's usually pretty easy to get the smoke going. And on a nice day like today, where it's not really overcast, it's nice and warm, sometimes I have trouble keeping the flame down, and I wind up spitting flames, which isn't ideal.
Okay.
I'll throw in a trick I've just started doing that seems to be working pretty well. And I'm cutting a few finer strips of burlap and tying a couple of knots in it, and then wrapping that inside the core of my wrap cone. That seems to hold the flame a little better without getting just flamey out.
Okay.
Good idea,
yeah.
I have a swarm trap up still. Should it be taken down? It's still peak swarm season. I'm hearing reports of swarms every couple of days, so it's still viable to have it up. If you have a swarm lure in there with lemongrass extract, that I think only lasts probably a couple of weeks, so maybe it would be a good idea if you've had it up for a while to put a new swarm lure in it. Also, the location may not be ideal. Maybe try putting it into a different tree or a little higher or lower.
What about wasps? I've got, I don't have any problem specifically right now, but I probably will later in the season. I was just wondering if you got any, I've got some traps, and I was wondering, just I can put them 20 or 30 feet away, and just wondering what your experience with wasps are.
So 20 or 30 feet away for your wasp trap is pretty good. You don't want them too close to your hive because you'll wind up attracting the wasps to your hive. The Western Yellowjacket typically isn't really active until probably sometime in August, but right now is the time to be capturing the queens, which is really the only thing you can do to seriously control their numbers. Every queen you catch, you're saving, you're killing a couple thousand of them. So Dan Scalard is the wasp expert in Oregon, and I do have his information here at Chenard's. I've got his business card always available. So if you have trouble with a nest, you know where it is, you can give him a call and he will come and get the nest for free. But if you're just trying to keep the numbers down, you don't know where any specific nest is, on April 1st, it's best to put out your traps, make sure you've got the pheromone on your little cotton ball, and you can actually add some wet cat food to the trap as well to continue to lure them throughout the season. But all you can really do, unfortunately, is use your entrance reducers when they become an issue, make the entrances smaller and easier to defend, and just continue catching those queens from April 1st until probably midsummer.
Trish had a question, or Jennifer had a question in chat about how much harm can yellowjackets do to a hive. Yellowjackets are active predators and colonial insects just like your bees, and a good-sized colony of yellowjackets can completely wipe out a hive, and they have been known to do so.
Particularly if your hive is weak. If you've got a really strong hive, you're probably not going to have too many troubles with them. But if you have a weak colony, they are really susceptible to wasp attacks.
I've got a lot of extra cedar around, some rough sawn cedar. Is there any comments on cedar for boxes, for supers? Is
Other
it
than
good
the
or
fact
bad?
that it's really expensive, it's actually a really nice thing to use for your honey boxes and your brood boxes. It lasts a lot longer than the typical pine that you'll see. Got a question from Rebecca. I froze a lot of honey frames from dead colonies last year and used the ones without brood or bees to feed the newbies this year. That is okay, but they do prefer fresh nectar. So when available, they won't really eat from the frames of honey. But in periods of nectar dearth, if you're not feeding your sugar syrup, they'll definitely use those frames.
You can also mix that stored honey with water, just like you would sugar water, so either 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio, and they'll take it up much better that way than they would in pure capped honey.
Let's see. Looks like I'm kind of behind in chat here.
Oh, I answered a couple of them, so I'll read on down, but yeah, I think we're almost up to date here.
Gotcha. Did you answer the one about feeding and smoke events?
Yes.
Okay.
And definitely, that smoke event last year was a killer. It contributed a lot to our amount of mortality in our local area this last winter, because there was an extensive period of time the bees were completely unable to forage. They forage by sun orientation, that polarized light. They couldn't fly. They couldn't find their way. So putting some supplies right in hive can really make the difference between survival and catastrophe when you have an ongoing event like that that lasts for day after day for a couple of weeks. You know.
It's also a really good idea to use a Boardman entrance feeder to give them water during a smoke event like that. I heard a couple of stories from beekeepers last year where the bees weren't able to find water. They were having a hard time moving around and they were lost. And I had a couple stories where the entire colony ended up in somebody's pool, unfortunately. So make sure that they've got plenty of access to food and water during something like that.
All right, I think we're at a wrap-up point. If anybody has any last-minute questions, I'll let them ask you direct. Camille, I'm going to go open up the store for the day. Thank you very much.
Aaron?
Thank you.
No worries. I had a really great time. Thanks everyone for all of the awesome questions, and I'll be here at the store every day but Monday and Tuesday, and if you can't find me, ask a cashier. I'm usually around. I think I'm going to wrap things up here, and thanks again.